I've got one flame to burn, one race that I can say I ran.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 21047.com podcast. My name is Keith Cartwright. I'm the host of this show, and I'm really glad to have you along listening in today, wherever it is that you're listening and whenever it is that you're listening in. Welcome along. My sponsor for today's show is my good friend Missy Blacker. Missy sponsors this podcast through the Patreon site where listeners, fans, friends, family can partner with me financially to try to grow this 21047.com mission to spread some light, run to darkness with the light that I have found in my running journey and a lot of these stories that I find in my running friends and runners across the country. Folks like Missy partnering with me financially allows me to have more time, more resources to do that. So I really appreciate her sponsoring this particular episode. Again, through Patreon. You can learn more about Patreon by going to my website, 21047.com, TWOTIM47.com. Go to the homepage and scroll down towards the bottom, and there you'll find some information about Patreon. So I appreciate you for thinking about doing that, checking it out. And for those who do sponsor me, a special shout out and a thank you. So this episode, a little bit different today. It's just me, no interview. I'm going to talk a little bit about my recent Houston Marathon attempt. I went down to Houston to attempt to run marathon number 2. And things didn't work out well, so we're going to talk about that. A lot of events led up to me going to Houston. If you're listening, there's a good chance you know that backstory. If not, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the podcast today talking about what got me to Houston. I'm going to spend more time talking about the running itself and the Houston Marathon. But if you're interested in that, again, you can go to my website, check out the blog, and there's some past blog post stories that I wrote about my journey to Houston and really just God's calling me there for a purpose much bigger than running. You can check that out there. So anyhow, off to Houston I went, and so I knew when I signed up for the Houston Marathon what a challenge it was that I was getting myself into. I ran my first marathon back in Richmond in November 2016, and there was a 7-hour time limit at Richmond, and I barely made it. I think I had about a minute and a half to spare, which was, a little bit over a 15-minute per mile pace. When I signed up for Houston, I did so knowing that the cutoff time in Houston was going to be 6 hours and about a 13-minute, 45-second pace. So I was going to have to go down there and run my second marathon an hour faster than I ran my first one. So that in itself was going to present a challenge. Now, training-wise and that pace, I did well. Now, the furthest I ran while I was training was an 18-miler, but I kept that 13:45. Actually, I think my pace was closer to 13:30 that day. And so I felt confident. The pace didn't have me too worried that I wouldn't be able to keep up with it. But again, I knew running it that much faster than my first one that it was going to be a challenge. So I got down there, race day came, lined up, felt good. Weather was perfect. I'm a cold weather runner, and I just don't run well in the heat. And so I was a little bit worried. Houston, it is wintertime, but I knew there was probably as much possibility that we're going to be running in the 70s than we were going to be running in the upper 30s, low 40s that we ultimately ran in down there. So I was really grateful. The weather was in my favor, certainly. And so we took off, and to be honest, through the first half of that race, through mile 13, I felt really good. I was on pace. I was probably, again, at about a 13.5 minute per mile pace, which is really where I wanted to be. I didn't want to flirt with being right at the 13:45 I needed in case I needed a bathroom break, needed to stop and rest for whatever reason. So I was building in just a little bit of a cushion, a little bit of a safety net. And so again, at the half marathon mark, I think I was right around a 13:30 pace, feeling really pretty good. My legs felt good, just didn't feel overly tired relative to other marathons or half marathons. Anytime I run 13 miles, there's a fair amount of fatigue that comes into that. But again, comparing to the other half marathons I'd run, I had no reason at that point to be thinking that I'm not going to make this. But it was only a couple of miles later, I think about mile 15, that I did feel some struggle start to come in. And it just snuck up on me pretty quick. And it wasn't as much as I was tired as my legs really started to give out on me. It was just getting harder to lift them. Each stride was getting a little bit harder. And then at the same time, I knew all along I was towards the back of the pack. I mean, I knew my pace was intentionally putting me near the back of the pack. But it was about mile 15. I took a look behind me, and I could see the flashing lights in the distance behind me. They weren't anywhere near me, but I could see them. And those flashing lights I knew were the end of the line. It was the rear pace car, a little bit different than the front pace car. And this is the one in the back that would ultimately tell me that I would need to speed up. But again, at mile 15, I was just beginning to feel the struggle. I wasn't thinking that, even at that point, I wasn't thinking I'm not going to finish this thing. But I did think this is going to be a little bit harder than I thought it was going to be at the half marathon. And at that point, doubt maybe started to creep in a little bit. When you can see the rear pack coming at you, that's a little more intimidating than not knowing it's that close to you. So at mile 17 is when the wheels really started to come off. I really was starting to struggle at that point, taking another step. At that point, the flashing lights were right up on me. And just mentally, I was in it. I just physically, my legs just were not responding to the willpower that I had, this don't quit attitude that I had. But my mental capacity just wasn't enough to get my body to move like I wanted it to. And back in Richmond, again, in 2016, when I ran my first marathon, mentally I started to doubt whether I was going to be able to keep putting one leg in front of the other. But there, my body was up for it. I just kept willing one more step, and one more step kept coming. But in Houston, it was just a little bit different. Like I said, my body wouldn't respond, and the back of the pack was right up on me. At that point I'm starting to, think that I could make it to mile 18 probably, and maybe even 19 or 20. I could maybe gut it out to keep the rear of the pack behind me that far, although I had some serious doubt about that. But in my mind, my legs were telling, there was no way that I was getting to 26.2. So at that point, I was pretty sure that I wasn't going to finish. And, that's when the officer pulled up beside me. He looked over at me, and the first thing he asked was if I was okay, which I really appreciated that. And then he let me know that if I couldn't keep ahead of the vehicle by mile 18, that they were going to have to ask me to get off the course. And at that point, after that conversation, I just went ahead and pulled myself off the course, because like I said, it was evident to me, it wasn't much of a doubt that I wasn't going to be able to finish it that day. So that was my marathon story. That's where it ended, and that's kind of how it ended. I didn't see it coming, to be honest with you. I had reasonable amounts of doubt going into it. Reasonable, by that I mean I just had some jitters, and nothing more than any other race really. I was pretty confident. And so after the fact, when I got pulled off and really kind of began to process this whole thing, I had to start asking myself what happened. Because again, I really felt like I was going to get this thing done. So I started with the reality that, again, it was going to be no easy task from the get-go, knocking an hour off my previous marathon time. I mean, that is a huge factor in this thing. To gain that much speed in a year's time. That was going to take an awful lot of improvement, which I thought I had made. Going to take a lot more speed, which I thought I had gathered in the last year. I was certainly healthier. I was lighter, but again, knocking an hour off, keeping, a couple of minutes per mile pace faster than I did at Richmond, that certainly after 15 miles, I think caught up with me a bit. I probably trained more than I did. Well, there's no doubt. I trained more for this marathon than I did the last one. But I think looking back on it, I probably didn't train enough. I've got a running joke with my buddy Tracy and some others about the Cartwright training plan, which has a lot of flexibility built into it. And we joke about it, but that flexibility is built into it. I have a very busy schedule. I work a couple of jobs. I've got 2 young boys, coach their team. So it is just impossible for me to get out there and follow a real rigid marathon training plan. I really stuck to, I was committed. I ran 3 days a week. I never forfeited the long run on the weekends. Like I said, I never did get up to the 20-mile run, but I felt good enough after the 18 that I really wasn't even worried about that. But in the end, I think that the training itself, again, factoring then that I needed to go so much faster than I did my first marathon, I think the training did play a role in that. I think I did need to train a little bit harder. And so that's another lesson I took away from it. One of the things that after the fact and talking with some folks, a lot of my friends that went down there, a lot of us that ran together, one of the things that most of us had in common in the aftermath was a lot of soreness. There were a lot of people much more sore after this race than they had been in previous races. Count me among them. And I don't know that I was that much more sore, but I was sore in some places that I had never been before, my ankles being one of them. The day after the marathon, I wondered for most of the day whether I had injured my ankles. My ankles had never been sore running before, but they were, in this case, post Houston. And so we all were kind of messaging back and forth, whining to one another about our different ailments and sorenesses. But then somebody pointed out that the Houston surface, the Houston roads are concrete, not some of them, all of them. So we spent the entire race running on concrete. And I never run on concrete outside of the occasional run on the sidewalks here in Ashland. So that was a brand new experience for me. Depending on where you read or who you research this with, concrete is much harder on you to run as a runner than asphalt is. Asphalt just has more give. If you go out and you hit the asphalt with a hammer, you're going to see a little bit of a dent made. If you go out and you hit your concrete with a hammer, you're not going to see a dent. You may crack it, and you're probably going to feel a little more vibration in your arm when you do that. So I did some research on this, and not extensive. I'm not a concrete versus asphalt expert now by any means. So this is not an attempt to tell everybody, keep away from the concrete. Don't go near there. But again, just in being real about my inability to finish, I wanted to do everything I could to figure out what I can do different next time. And so I found an article from hillrunner.com. And this is, just one of the sort of stories they had in there around this whole idea of concrete versus asphalt. And what they said is concrete is a much harder surface than asphalt or macadam. It's the worst commonly encountered surface that you can run on and should be avoided like the plague. So they're telling you to avoid it like the plague. I'm not, but I'm just reading you what they said. To compare the hardness of concrete and asphalt, hit each surface with a hammer and see how it feels to your hand and arm. You will find quite a difference. You will leave a dent in the asphalt, but not in the concrete, kind of like I had just said a minute ago. It says, when running, your feet strike the surface with a force of up to 6 times your body weight. And so for a guy like me who's weighing about 220, that's a lot of force. And unless you land dead mid-foot, all that force is concentrated on a very small landing surface. So, when you can picture that much force, again, for a guy who's a bit heavier, all being pounded into one place, it kind of started to explain a little bit of maybe that extra soreness and, like I said, almost near injury feeling in my ankles. For a typical heel striker, it's maybe a square inch or two. Let's assume that a person who weighs 120 pounds, let's assume that's not me, lands at 5 times body weight with a heel strike that covers 2 square inches. That's equivalent to an initial strike force of 300 pounds per square inch upon contact. So if asphalt is really 10 times softer than concrete, as the study that Bill mentioned said, and there's a different study attached to this article, that would make a big difference in initial energy dissipation versus that which shoes, normal pronation, or that's just kind of how your foot lands and rolls, and body structure have to absorb. So, in summary, it's really just saying that asphalt allows you to absorb over a little broader area the full extent of the blow when your feet hit the surface. And concrete just sends a bigger force into a smaller area, and that smaller area is absorbing the brunt of the blow when your foot again hits the surface. Now, again, I don't know how much that factored into it. I think it was a piece, just one of the pieces. And again, I'm going to keep saying I was too slow to finish. I think that ultimately it was just a bigger challenge than maybe I was up for, but these are just some of the factors that played into that. The other one too, and it may be the biggest of all looking back on it, because, and again, this is a running joke with me before marathons. My friend Lachelle, I always say, I do not do run buffets. I go for a half marathon or a marathon. I'm not going to wear myself out with the mile or the 5K or the 10K that you couple with those to get extra medals. It is exhausting enough. It's challenging enough for me to take on these big races. I don't need these smaller races wearing me out before it. And in Houston, I didn't run. There was a 5K the day before. I didn't run it. But what we did do, I took my whole family went to Houston for this trip. And so we did a lot of sightseeing, and we got there the Wednesday before the Sunday race. So we had several days worth of sightseeing. And as an example, on the Saturday before the race, my watch said that I walked almost 8 miles in between watching some friends run the 5K. We went and saw a museum. We walked to a restaurant. And so I walked, over a 10K the day before. And actually the Friday before that, we also did a lot of walking. I had a lot of walking. I spent a lot of time on my feet leading up to the marathon, certainly more time on my feet than any other race I'd ever run. Again, was that the factor? No, but I think it was a factor. And my point in all of it is I'm not trying to excuse away for a minute the reality that I failed at this marathon attempt. But I am trying to make the most out of that failed attempt because I want to do better. I want to walk away from this experience different. And I don't think that opportunity comes only in success. I think there's a lot of opportunity, and I believe more, really, when it gets down to it, that comes in failure. Not that I'm sitting here thinking, boy, let me find more ways to fail. Nobody goes about it like that. But when you look back, I think, we all kind of see where we have learned from different failures. So, I'm going to move on to that piece. How do you deal with failure? And, too often, I think culturally speaking, and just in so many circles, we have come to see failure as this bad thing. And in my mind, it's not such a bad thing. I think it has the potential to be. I think failure trips a lot of people up. And I think it sends them on a negative course. My goal is that my failure is not going to send me on a negative course. I've been saying over and over this week, I've kind of come up with this simple sort of slogan that's going to be mine moving forward, which is never try, never fail, never fly. And, that's just kind of become my motto this week. And I think it will be for a while to come, because failure can sit in you and eat at you. I've got these images of all of my friends finishing their marathons, finishing what I set out to do. And, those pictures, they sit with you. You can't just erase them. But on the other hand, what do I do with those pictures? Do I sit and beat myself up for however long, I guess it's appropriate for marathon non-finishers to beat themselves up? Or do I take those pictures and figure out, where do I go from here with them? So this week I've been doing a lot of thinking about failure, doing some writing about failure. And so, in sitting on that bus, because that's what happened, there was a whole group of us. And so this bus comes to the back of the pack and loads us all up. So all of us, quote unquote, failures, marathon failures, were sitting on the bus. I assure you, we were not talking to each other like we were failures. There was a lot of picking each other up. It was, once again, this reinforcement. The running community is beautiful. There wasn't one person sitting on that bus beating themselves up or somebody else up. And so it's why I love this community. But in the quiet moments of sitting there and really thinking about, okay, I'm taking a bus back to the finish line of this marathon that I came to finish, this marathon that many people had followed, many people had supported. So how do I deal with that reality that I'm going to be unloaded at the finish line off this it was a big charter bus. So it wasn't even like a small school bus or something. But I'm going to tell you, we had this series at church earlier this summer, and it was about perfectionism, really, our ideas, our worldly idea of perfectionist, and how we all so many times try to be perfect with all of these things we attempt, whether it's our job, whether it's running, parenting, we put so much pressure on ourselves to be perfect. And we do that because we take so much of our value, we see so much of our value in how good we do all of these things. We find our personal value in our jobs. And so when we find our value in our job, it's just natural to try to be perfect at our job. If we're not only do we not do as well as our job, but more importantly, we start to see ourselves as less valuable. If we put all of our value in being these perfect parents, well, when we're not the perfect parent, we kind of look at ourselves as less valuable. This whole message series was about this reality that our greatest value comes in the reality that God loves us. He created us. He knows exactly what we're like. Whatever failures we see in ourselves, whatever flaws we see in ourselves, the flaws and failures we beat ourselves up over, God looks so far beyond them and loves us in spite of them, if you want to say that. He loves us as a result of some of those, unbeknownst to us, even though we can't understand that. God, our failures, they impact God's love for us zero. So sitting in that bus, my thoughts went to that sermon series. They went to that reality that I didn't finish my marathon. I'm on a bus with a bunch of marathon failures, and God loves every one of us as much as he did before we even started that race, before the race was even an idea. God didn't love us any less in that moment than he did. And so in that moment, I really challenged myself, and I asked myself where I was going to find my true value, where I was going to feel my own personal value. And it was God. That was it. If I was going to find value in being a marathon finisher there in Houston, then all my value went out the door. And if I was going to put my value in what my friends might think about me or what other runners might think about me, well, then there was a potential that my value was going to go down at that point. That's not where I was going. I was going with this God who loves me as much for attempting as he does for finishing. So that was the first step. And then talk about those friends. So there were a lot of friends who went down there with me, and there were a lot of them sitting back at that finish line. And I knew I was going to have to walk up to them. Many of them had already finished their race. They were going to see me outside the course. They were standing there waiting for me to see me finish the marathon inside the course. They were standing at the finish line, expecting, counting, kind of sending messages. I'd be running down that chute across the finish line. So sort of juxtapositioning that whole idea with this idea now, I was going to be walking up from outside the course to greet them. But there was never, ever even a momentary doubt in my mind what my friends' reactions were going to be. I knew they were going to be supportive. I knew they were going to see me as valuable as they did at the starting line that morning. I knew my value in their eyes had not diminished. I knew my value in my family's eyes had not diminished. That played a huge part in allowing me to, first and foremost, feel this love from God that I needed most in that moment and keeping my focus straight. And it allowed me to not even get into a process of beating myself up. I'm telling you, and I've been there before, and I've been there in other races before where I have not did as good as I wanted to, didn't finish, and I spent an unhealthy amount of time beating myself up over that. So I don't know, maybe I've matured as a runner, maybe I've matured as a Christian, maybe I'm a deeper thinking person, but I'm telling you, in the moment, once I realized this is not my day, this isn't happening, I immediately sort of started processing where to go from there, and not 1 minute of it was beating myself up. And I truly owe a lot of that to my friends. I've surrounded myself with some incredibly supportive friends. I knew what I was going to get. So when I got off the bus and I was freezing, it was cold, but I found my friends, and when I walked up to them, they all clapped, just like I had finished. And that was real meaningful to me, and it was real helpful, and it's probably allowed me to move on in a very positive way as quickly as I've tried to do it. And so that was important. So dealing with failure, again, knowing my value comes from how much God loves me, and God's love doesn't change for me when I don't finish a marathon. My friends, knowing that they value me for this person that I am, and their value, the way they see me, doesn't change when I don't finish a marathon. Those were really the key first steps in dealing with the failure. But the other one is, and I think more people might relate to this piece, was, I owned that failure right off the bat. I've had a lot of friends reach out this past week and say, hey, you're not a failure, or I don't think that's failing. Well, and I appreciate that. I know they're, just trying to pick me up and be the supportive friends that I have. Trust me, I know I failed when, by the truest of the definition, I set out to do the Houston Marathon. I could not do it. I failed. And I owned that, and I had no trouble owning that. And because I did, that allowed me to really start looking back at the race itself and immediately kind of start figuring out what I could have done differently, what I would do differently next time. Part of that comes too, as I look back on my life, and I say this all the time, I've had some real demons in my life, but everything God has me doing in my life today is built on how I overcame those demons, the lessons I learned in the darkness of those demons. And so when you've had a life that's had a fair amount of failure in it, when you've lived a life where you've made some real bad mistakes in your life, and then you are old enough and beyond them enough to look at it and say, holy cow, those failures really set me up to do some real productive, to do some really cool things in my life, most of them with and for other people. You really don't hesitate to own failure. You don't look at it the same way as you do if you might not have had the life or the opportunities to fail at least once, maybe repeatedly, and then see on the other end of those failures are some incredible growth opportunities that wouldn't have come without the failure. So I think it's important that you own your failure, begin to look at it. What can I learn from this process? So you can make the best of that moment of failure. You can use it for, again, is this going to be an opportunity where I end up falling down, or am I going to fly in this moment? And the flying comes from maximizing the learning experience from the failure. I think too many times we let the emotion of failure, and again, I'm not telling you I didn't have any disappointment in that moment. This wasn't just like a light switch. I mean, there was a lot of that. I came all that way to do this, so there was certainly a fair amount of disappointment. Runners know when you train this long for something, to not be able to pull it off, it's not an easy deal. But I think too many times where failure turns out to be a real negative thing is when we get caught up in the emotion of failure. And I think that suffocates the opportunity to learn from failure. If we never get beyond the disappointment we feel, the beating up ourselves that we engage in, this fear that we might end up feeling and trying to do something again, all of these emotions that come with failure that really have nothing productive to them. I think that's why failure ends up being seen as such a negative thing. But again, because I'm an expert failer. I have failed over and over in my life. But I look back in this rearview mirror of failure in my life, and I can just see so much of who I am built on the back of mistakes and failure. There's no doubt. I have no idea, today where this journey is going to go in response to my Houston failure, but something good's coming from it. Maybe many things good are going to come from it. I can tell you that right now. And, I think that's why it makes me confident in the face of failure, because I own it. I own my failures. I don't have any problem saying that I failed, and I'm very committed to not getting caught up in the emotion of that failure, but embracing the opportunity to grow from it and learn. And the other thing with that, and I've talked a lot about this week, is, failure doesn't define you. I think that's the other thing. People get so wrapped up in these things they're trying to accomplish. Again, whether it's a job, whether it's your parenting, whether it's this civic group that you belong with. We attach ourselves to doing so well, to being so significant in those roles, that when we end up being less significant in them or we fail at them, I think sometimes we think that means that we're a different person, because we define ourselves by so many of these things that we belong to, these things that we try to take on. But, failure, it's pretty significant, really, in a moment in time, because from that point of failure, from that moment in time, you're going to go one or two directions, right? You're going to, again, beat yourself up in that, and you're going to end up in a darker place, in a more negative place than you were before you ever took this thing on. I mean, failure has a way to rock you and set you back, or this moment in time is going to spur you on to becoming stronger, to becoming more determined, to become a more committed person, to maybe even have bigger dreams than you had before. But failure itself doesn't redefine who you were before you took on that race. I am not a different person than I was before I took on that race. My values are the same. God loves me the same. I'm still the same person in my friends' eyes. What has changed from that moment of failure is I'm now moving in a bit of a different direction. I'm moving with more determination, reevaluating and resetting some goals. I'm telling you, I got some dreams now in response of that failure that I don't know that I had when I took that race on. But people need to know that when I fail, you're really just at a question mark point in life. You're not a new person. You're just at a new point. And that point says, are you going to step up and fly in response to this, or are you going to fall down in the midst of it all and let this failure beat you up? And so, I guess that kind of, in wrapping this up, it does lead to, so what direction do I go? And I've already pretty much made it clear I'm going to fly from this thing. One of the things when I texted, my wife texted me some really encouraging comments when it became clear that I wasn't going to make it. And it was pretty short after that. I responded, well, I can tell you where I will be next January. And by that I meant I'll be back here next January finishing this race that I couldn't finish. Then, and in a more rational moment of time, I started thinking about it, and something pretty important to me. One of the hard parts about being in Houston last weekend was I missed the Megs Miles race, the first Megs Miles race back here in Richmond. And most of my friends that were with me are part of this Megs Miles supporters group. You can find it on Facebook, Megs Miles supporters. And so Meg's first race ever on the 4-year anniversary of her death was back here in Hanover County on the day before the Houston Marathon. So there was no way I was missing that race next year. So I said, well, it's not going to be next year that I do this Houston Marathon again, because I'm going to be a part of that Megs Miles race. Well, it wasn't long after that, my friend Robin reached out and said, hey, did you know the Houston Marathon is 1 week later next year? So that conflict was suddenly gone. I imagine God had a little handiwork in that. And so I can tell you one thing that is going to happen. I'll be in Houston next year, and I will be setting out to finish what I didn't start. The other piece to that is, and I didn't get into it too much on this podcast, you can go back to some previous podcasts, but, I went down there to support the folks that are struggling in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey. And, when we saw it, because one of the things we did before the race was to tour some of these places that have been real devastated, to see some of the work St. Andrew's Church has been doing in some of these communities. There's a lot of work that's left to be done. And one of the things God was telling me on that bus was there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And he wasn't talking to me about the work I need to do to finish a marathon. He was talking to me about the work he needs me to do to continue supporting those people. That this was not a one-time feel-good, jump in there and do a little bit, make some sort of a difference, and then pull out. He was telling me, I think, I got another year worth of you being real invested in these people's lives, to be real invested in the healing capacity of St. Andrew's Church. And if that happens to coincide with me going down and finishing this marathon, then so be it. And that would be a great plan. I today am really I'm first and foremost committed to continuing to help these folks down there suffering in the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey. But I'm committed to going down because even though I'm handling failure well, I'm a competitive person, and this will continue to gnaw at me, not in a real negative way, but it's always going to be back there. I didn't finish it. And just like the Patrick Henry half marathon a couple of years ago that I went and got pulled off the course and got committed that a year later I would finish it. And I did. And that really exercised a real sort of demon in my life, and it felt good to do it. Houston is going to be the same deal. I'm going to need to go down there and finish that race, more because I know I can. I know I was prepared to do it. I know I could do it. I just think I need to do some things differently, and I will. So that's really kind of where I'm focused right now. I've got several half marathons coming up in the next couple of months. And then I got my April birthday month, and I've kind of got a crazy sort of goal in mind for then that I'll talk about more later. But all that to say, I assure you, my mind is pointed forward. It's pointed forward in my running journey. It's pointed forward in this faith journey that I'm on, where God uses failure to remind me that he's with me, that he's going to use the failure in my life probably much more powerful than he uses these successes, at least these things I consider to be successes. And so I'm ready. I'm ready to roll with that. God called me to Houston. God's calling me to respond to my Houston failure. And I'm sure that as I figure that out, he'll show me he has different plans for what that was all about. And I'm up for it because it's been a good Houston journey. I don't regret any of it. I'm sure I'll even regret any of it less moving on down the road as I continue to see just really what came from that weekend. But I thank all of you, anybody listening who followed that journey, who supported it, who reached out to me. I'm grateful. I love you all for that. I'm fine. I am ready to, again, get back to doing these podcasts, getting back to interviewing some really cool people on some real inspiring running journeys. So that's going to be a lot of my focus going forward. All my friends that were down there with me in Houston, God, I love them all. They were perfect. They were fun. And part of what helped me too was seeing so many of them finish. Man, they ran some great races down there, some speedy ones, watching Tracy and Dee, come up the finish line there, the last of us, and knowing that they put that struggle in and got there. I took a lot of pleasure in them coming to Houston to run this race with me, and getting to see them finish that thing was a real blessing, and I'm thankful for it. So anyhow, there will be a blog post about this race that goes a little more into our work with St. Andrew's Church, the people down there, just some of the beauty that happened in our service down there. So you can go to 2tim47.com, TWOTIM47.com, go to the blog link, and that will take you there. By the time you listen to this, that blog post should be up there. And so read that, and hey, get out there, run this week. The weather is much more beautiful than it has been. Just make the best of this week. And again, if you fail, get up and fly. There's nothing wrong with failing. It can be a really healthy point forward moment in time. So get out there, and hey, get out there and fail this week. I'm not sure I've ever ended a podcast by saying get out there and fail this week, but that's what I'm going to end this one with. Get out there and fail this week. God bless y'all, and thank you.
Despite the setting sun.